The world is facing a global plastic crisis.
Plastic pollution threatens both biodiversity and human health.
La pollution plastique est une crise planétaire aux conséquences dévastatrices sur la biodiversité, sur le climat et pour notre santé.
Almost 13 million tons of plastic enters the ocean every single year, affecting 2/3 of marine mammals, half the world's seabird species.
La contaminación por plásticos tiene un impacto devastador en la naturaleza y afecta desproporcionadamente a los países en desarrollo.
In the coming decades, plastic production is expected to double. Plastic waste in nature is predicted to more than triple, and plastic in the ocean will increase by a factor of 4.
This spring, the world came together in Nairobi, Kenya, at the 5th UN Environmental Assembly and agreed that we have to start the long work of ending plastic pollution.
This is so decided.
For that reason, Rwanda and Norway jointly agreed to invite countries to set up a high ambition coalition to end plastic pollution.
Let's put an end to plastic pollution together.
Éradiquer la pollution plastique d'ici 2040.
To end plastic pollution by 2040.
The High Ambition Coalition is committed to urgent action through an international legally binding treaty.
An agreement which ensures that plastic is produced, consumed, reused and recycled sustainably.
That encompasses the whole life cycle of plastics, including microplastics.
350,000 chemicals present in different manufactured products, including plastics.
À peine 10% des plastiques sont recyclés dans le monde.
La pollution plastique est un problème planétaire qui nécessite une transition mondiale vers une économie circulaire sans déchets dans ce domaine.
ამ პრობლემის განსაზღვრად აუცილებელია კომპლექსური ღონისძიებების განხორციელება. კერძოდ, პლასტიკის პრევენცია, პლასტიკის ნარჩენების მართვის თანამედროვე სისტემების.
We must reduce plastic consumption and production to sustainable levels.
Make sure that the plastic that we still use will actually be recycled and used again and again and again.
Only by working together we can solve this challenge.
Look forward to your engagement and support.
For a world free of plastic pollution by 2040.
Rwanda and Norway invite ambitious nations to join the coalition and be part of the historic mission to end plastic pollution.
Dear colleagues, welcome to this webinar on how the new treaty on plastic pollution, which is now under negotiation, how this treaty can help increase circularity of plastics in the economy. This webinar is organized by the governments of Ghana and Norway with support from the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution. My name is Magnus Løvold. I'm with the Norwegian Academy of International Law, and I will moderate today's session. There are a high number of people in the audience, and we have a fabulous panel of speakers with us today. The speakers who will share their thoughts and perspectives with us over the next 90 minutes include Oliver Bauchi with the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation of Ghana, Stine Risdal Eriksen with the Ministry of Climate and Environment of Norway. We have Amila Bainayaka with the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan, and Jody Russell, who is the Global Public Affairs Lead on Packaging and Sustainability at Nestlé, and also co-chair of the Policy Working Group of the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty. We also have Fiona Dury with CFlex, and last but not least, Griffins Ochieng, who's the program coordinator with the Center for Environment, Justice and Development, or CJAD. Many thanks to all the panelists for agreeing to take time off their, I know, very busy schedules to participate in today's discussion, and we will all hear from them in a minute. We would, as always, like this event to be interactive. Should you wish in the audience to make a comment or ask a question to our panelists, please write in the Q&A box, which can be toggled with a button on the bottom of your screen, or click the raise hand button for a live intervention. And then we will do our best to address your comments and questions in the latter half of this event. Now, to kick off our discussions, I'd like to first of all give the floor to Erlend Arneson Haugen, the coordinator of the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution at the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Nairobi. Erlend, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Magnus, very much, and welcome all to this event on plastics treaty provisions to increase circularity of plastics in the economy, co-hosted by Norway and Ghana as two of the members of the High Ambition Coalition. And this event is one of a series of many High Ambition Coalition webinars leading up to the second negotiation meeting in Paris, the INC2, on options for elements in the UN Plastics Treaty. And we are indeed hoping to get into the details of potential elements and obligations and provisions. You saw in the video the High Ambition Coalitions. I'm not going to introduce that, but I can say that the coalition currently has 51 members from all regions in the world working together to develop an ambitious international legally binding instrument with a common ambition to end plastic pollution by 2040. And the coalition have identified 3 strategic goals. Firstly, to restrain plastic consumption and production. Secondly, to enable a circular economy for plastics that protects the environment and human health. And thirdly, to achieve environmentally sound management of waste. The coalition ministers agreed on a joint statement ahead of the first negotiation meeting, INC1 in Uruguay, where they recognized the imperative to develop common internationally and binding obligations and control measures in the plastics treaty. And as the coalition members and minister develop its joint statement ahead of the INC2, the 2 co-chairs, Norway and Rwanda, have submitted a written submission to INC2 on potential options for elements toward this plastics treaty. And they propose 4 categories of provisions in the plastics treaty, which is the basis of our discussions. First, provisions to reduce production of primary plastic polymers. Second, provisions to eliminate and restrict specific plastic polymers, chemicals, and products of concern. And thirdly, as we are discussing today, provisions to increase circularity of plastics in the economy. And fourth, provisions on eliminating the release of plastics to air, water, and land. So today we are here to discuss in more detail the third set of provisions to increase circularity of plastics. And the background is, of course, that less than 10% of all plastics produced has been recycled. Most plastic products is designed to become waste, and we have a highly linear plastics economy. So in the submissions of the co-chairs, they present some possible provisions to increase the circularity. The first is a set of general obligations on product design and manufacture that each party should be required to ensure that all plastic products produced or put on the market are in line with some eco or sustainability criteria. Furthermore, they propose targets and guidance for recycled content and transparency requirement for chemical and material composition for all plastic products. And they also propose obligation targets and guidelines both for reuse and recycling. But this is just the starting point for our discussion here today. We need to go deeper into the details. What is needed in the treaty? What does it mean in practical terms to transition from a linear to a circular plastics economy? Is it possible to get to 100% and so on? And just lastly, the co-chair submission presents a variety of options and obligations identified by members of the High Ambition Coalition, and does not represent an agreed or exhaustive list of measures considered by members. And on a similar note, we will have many coalition members as participating in these webinars, and they will present both their national and regional positions and may also refer to the agreed positions. So with that, I hand it over to you, back to you, Magnus, and the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Erlend, and I think that really provides us with a clear understanding of what we're here to discuss. We had a session on Thursday last week to talk about possible treaty obligations to reduce plastic production and consumption. And from our discussion then, I think it became clear that there is indeed a need to reduce the global production of plastics, but it is also clear that plastics as a material will still be with us for many decades to come. And the question then becomes, what do we do in the context of this treaty about the plastics that we cannot immediately prohibit or eliminate or phase out or phase down? Which treaty provisions can be adopted to ensure that this plastic does not end up as pollution in the environment? I am not myself equipped to answer that question, so I will leave that to our great panelists. And Oliver, Stina, Amila, Jody, Fiona, and Griffins, you have all drafted or contributed to the drafting of several of the submissions made to the next round of negotiations in Paris in late May. And I know also that you have clear ideas about what the new treaty should do to enhance circularity of plastics in the economy and what this may entail and require. As last week, for those in the audience who were logged into our webinar then, I would like to start with a tour around the virtual table and ask all of our panelists briefly to tell us what, in their view, is the single most important measure or the single most important obligation that a new treaty should contain to achieve greater circularity of plastics, provided, of course, that you all agree that this should be among the treaty's objectives. I would like to ask you, Oliver, to first share your and Ghana's initial perspectives on this. Please, Oliver, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Magnus. Among other things, the Union Resolution 514 calls for the promotion of sustainable production and consumption of plastics through product design and environmentally sound waste management, including through resource efficiency and circular economy. I believe that as the High Ambition Coalition, we must aspire to the ultimate goal of eliminating plastic pollution. And in doing so, we must adopt approaches that are bold and innovative and which address most of the provisions outlined in the resolution. To increase circularity of plastics in the economy, that will lead eventually to the end of plastic pollution. Ghana has proposed that the legally binding instrument should include a global plastic pollution fee as one of the tools based on the polluter pays principle. The GPPF will serve as a catalyst to accelerate a just transition to circular economy. It will boost global business and create much needed jobs globally, especially in developing countries. And above all, the GPPF will serve as a control measure and also as an effective means of implementation. Over many decades, generation of plastic waste has far outstripped our capacity to manage the waste. The latest data on this pollution gap shows that in 2019, plastic production was 460 million tons, generating 350 million tons of plastic waste. However, just 15% of plastic waste was collected for recycling, and only 9% was actually recycled. This means that just 33 million tons of plastic waste was recycled that year, while the volume of legacy plastic pollution grew by a further 78 million tons. As a control measure, the GPPF will contribute to reducing plastic demand through a higher price. The OECD, for instance, has found that significant declines in plastic production, consumption, waste, and pollution will be largely due to a fiscal charge. As a means of implementation, the GPPF could reliably raise significant and predictable revenues that could fund a safe and sound waste management infrastructure for all member states, thus providing a huge capacity to close the pollution gap that is based on circularity. These revenues would also fund the elimination of legacy plastic pollution through the proposed legacy fund. The Mindero Foundation, for instance, recommends a levy on fossil fuel polymer production and or consumption to generate funds for scaling plastics collection, sorting, and recycling. Now, the estimated cost of establishing a waste management infrastructure to close this pollution gap exceeds $300 billion, or significantly higher by some estimates. Further, developing countries will bear a significant portion of these costs because their waste management infrastructure is much weaker. The OECD estimates that the bulk of the cost to develop waste management infrastructure will be borne by non-OECD countries, with the largest cost in sub-Saharan Africa. These costs also do not account for cleaning up legacy plastic pollution. Now, with every year that the pollution gap is not closed, the volume of legacy plastic pollution in the environment grows. Considerable funding is therefore needed to implement fully a legally binding instrument that increases circularity in the economy and eventually lead to the ending of plastic pollution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to you, Oliver, so very much for that initial interventions. A global plastic pollution fee, a very interesting idea indeed, and we will have a chance to discuss this in more detail in a minute. I'd just like to also bring in the other panelists, and I would now turn to Stine from Norway's point of view. What is the single most important measure that the treaty should contain to enhance circularity of plastics? Over to you, Stine.
Thank you, Magnus, and hello, everyone. My name is Stine Eriksen, and I work at the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment. I work with waste and marine litter, and I'm also part of the Norwegian team following the international negotiations of the new plastic treaty. As we all know, global plastic production and consumption patterns are not sustainable. While plastic is a useful material for many purposes, the downside is a pattern where the global environmental footprint from current production is much higher than it needs to be. We have to turn this trend. In order to do that, we need to reduce the production and consumption of plastic polymers. We need to eliminate and restrict certain chemicals, polymers, and plastic products of concern. We need to bring forward more sustainable plastic products in our markets. And we need to eliminate the release of plastics into the environment. It is the third point that I want to highlight today: the need to bring forward more sustainable plastic products to go into a circular value chain for plastic. Promoting a more circular plastics economy is a means to reach the end goal, which is to reduce the climate and environmental footprint from plastic, including plastic pollution. And to reach this goal, we have to make sure that the plastic products that we still need in our society adheres to agreed sustainability criteria. For example, that they can be reused and recycled. We have to change consumption patterns by all consumers at a global scale. We have to significantly increase resource efficiency in the value chain, and we have to take control of chemicals and substances of concern in plastic. The latter, both because of the risk hazardous chemicals in plastic can pose to the environment and people, but also because these chemicals hamper our efforts to recycle plastic and use it in new products. We also see that transparency and access to information is key to achieve a more circular value chain. It should therefore be a requirement to provide documentation of the sustainability aspects of products and to make this information easily available. This is very important in order to scale up the circular economy from frontrunners to the mainstream economic players. We hope that discussions now can get into the specifics about how the treaty can urgently and over time make sustainable products and consumption the norm. So I look forward to dig deeper into these issues over the next hour. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Stine. I am also very much looking forward to that. A sustainability criteria, also a good idea that we will discuss more in the coming hour. I would now like to turn to you, Amila, from a researcher's point of view. How can a treaty on plastic pollution contribute to greater circularity? Over to you, Amila. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Angus, and hi everybody, and thank you for having me today. It's great to have this timely and important conversation with the panel and audience. Like Angus mentioned, like apart from working as a policy researcher at Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, IGS. So I represent a scientist coalition for an effective plastic treaty. So our goal is to assist, to support, to achieve an effective global plastic treaty based on robust scientific evidence in the interest of protecting public and planetary health. So having said that, let me go to your question. To achieve circularity, decoupling economic growth from resource use and from environmental impacts need to be done. For example, increasing the economic activity per unit use of primary natural resources can be one aspect, and then the resource circulation, design, redesign, innovation comes to support. I'm pretty sure that panelists from industry will talk more about innovation, reduction through innovation, and economic models like EPR. So I would like to highlight one aspect to increase circularity of plastic, increase the circularity of plastics in the economy. That's information disclosure. A clear reporting metrics combined with full transparency and disclosure in public and private sector actors in order to achieve a full picture across the entire plastic economy need to be done. This need to be supported by capacity building to fill gaps on across the plastic value chain. We know there are more than 10,000 chemicals used for plastic production. Existing reporting systems may neither strong nor stockholders lacking of capacity to contribute effectively. For that, especially in developing regions, so we face a lack of capacity to monitor and measure, and certain like I mentioned, more than 1,000 chemicals or 10,000 chemicals. So this need to be addressed to effective circular economy, increase the circularity of plastics. Yeah. Having said that, over to you, Mangus. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for that, Amila. Very useful to have the science coalitions and the research perspective in these discussions, and we will get a chance to talk more to you later on as well. I would now like to turn to you, Jody, from the business coalition's point of view, to enhance circularity. What's the most important measure? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Magnus. The Business Coalition is a group of businesses, finance, and supporting NGOs who are committed to an ambitious treaty. We're supported by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the World Wildlife Fund. And we grew from 100 companies last year to over 300 today. So we have 3 targets for the treaty that are very similar to the high ambition government coalitions. I'll focus on our second point, which is the circulation of plastic items that can't be eliminated, with examples from 2 areas. One is around product design for recycling, and we'll look at the golden design rules for consumer packaged goods as an example of this. And secondly, well-designed extended producer responsibility laws to enable the financing of collection, sorting, and recycling systems. So the first one, product design for circular systems. This is about matching harmonized design requirements for plastic materials and products with the establishment of infrastructure and systems for recirculation after use as a prerequisite to keep them in the economy. We're looking at policy actions that can target product design that need to be aligned with the reduction of plastic production and use through a circular economy approach. Disclosure of information on chemical composition of plastics as key to ensure plastics are safe to be made, used, reused, and eventually recycled. Now, the consumer goods industry already developed a voluntary product design framework and implements it on a voluntary basis through the Consumer Goods Forum's Golden Design Rule program. We have objectives like eliminating problematic or difficult to recycle packaging, increasing recycling value for the types of packaging that are recycled at scale in today's recycling systems, increasing the value in future recycling systems for packaging types that aren't recycled yet today at scale today, and improving consumer communications. So I'll just give you a couple of these specific design rules, and then I'll put a link in the chat later. One is eliminating, for example, excess head space on packaging, the empty space that's occupied by air. Another is reducing plastic overwraps. Increasing recycling value in PET by shifting to clear or transparent green and blue. Reducing virgin plastic in B2B packaging and using B2C packaging for non-food contact applications. These are examples of the different types of design rules that we've developed in the industry and over 100 global companies are implementing today. So if we look at why is this really important and what's the business rationale for product design? If the treaty requires governments to look beyond setting up isolated national circular systems, it helps businesses reduce operational complexity, helps us manage compliance risks and costs across markets. And by taking a more harmonized and mandatory approach toward designing for recyclability and facilitating trade policy, this ensures that plastic products can be recycled in practice and at scale, and the treaty will enable businesses, both large businesses and SMEs seeking to trade regionally, to align their innovation strategies and their planning for products. Now, I know we're tight on time, so I'll just touch briefly on deposit return. We know that there's substantial funding required to expand waste management capabilities and recycling infrastructure worldwide. We know that funding is unlikely to solely come from public budgets, and governments need to enhance the regulatory mechanisms that will ensure adequate funding. So for us, the adoption of mandatory and well-designed, fee-based extended producer responsibility and complementary deposit return is really an appropriate solution for financing waste management in the future. We know today over 58 countries have national EPR schemes in place. Another 38 have legislation in draft. And so we see the treaty needing to establish minimum requirements for both the design and the implementation of EPR schemes to ensure an adequate level of regulatory harmonization across countries so that businesses can have trade facilitated and we can be aligning with the same types of policies in one market and in a neighboring market.
Brilliant.
I'll pause there and go back to you, Magnus.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for that, Jody. So the design rule and EPR, we will also have a chance to discuss this in more detail later on in this session. Thank you so much for those initial remarks. I would now like to include and invite you, Fiona, to also share your and CFLEX perspectives on this issue. I know that you have also submitted or made a submission to the INC, which is many of these participants here have made submissions. They're all available on the website of the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee. So you can look up those after this webinar for more information as well. But now to you, Fiona, for your initial remarks on this question.
Thank you, Magnus, and good morning. And indeed, we have submitted a written submission. So let me start by introducing CFLEX. CFLEX is the Circular Economy for Flexible Packaging Initiative. We are a technical project and a consortium of almost 200 stakeholders from across the entire flexible packaging value chain. And we are working together to implement our model to make flexible packaging circular, so to actually make it circular in practice. Flexible packaging is a necessary use of plastics. It's used to protect and distribute essential products like food and medicines to consumers in an efficient and affordable way. And it's also recyclable and recycled using a mechanical infrastructure that's commonly used at scale around the world. So to the treaty. At CFLEX, we believe that this global treaty is a big opportunity to support and accelerate a transition to a circular economy for necessary plastics at a global scale. And I think my key message today is that legally binding measures are needed to drive this transition. Legislation is needed to set a level playing field, and that's, I know, a commonly used term. So let me illustrate by way of an example. Companies that want to invest, for example, in design for circularity may be hindered or prevented from doing so if the cost means that they can no longer compete, and therefore packaging designed for circularity will never actually reach the market. Mandatory design for circularity criteria could help to overcome this challenge and would help companies that want to do the right thing to actually be able to do the right thing, and to bring their competitors along with them. Legislation is also needed to overcome challenges that may not be possible to solve by market forces alone. Legally binding measures are needed to ensure that sustainably funded systems are set up to collect, sort and recycle, especially for materials whose economic value may not be sufficient to generate income to cover the costs of establishing and running those systems. So to answer your question, what is the single most important measure to drive circularity in the treaty? CFLEX's asks for the treaty are twofold. First, we're asking for harmonized and mandatory design for circularity criteria for flexible packaging to be set, and for parties to the treaty to be obliged to implement and enforce them. And secondly, we're asking for the parties to the treaty to be obliged to ensure that sustainably funded systems are set up for collection, sorting and recycling, again, involving EPR, if that's suitable. We're looking into that in Europe and outside. And also ensuring that flexible packaging is included in those systems from the outset. So with that, I thank you for your time and look forward to the discussion and the questions.
Great, thank you so much, Fiona, for that. So harmonized and mandatory design for circularity for flexible packaging, the enforcement measure that you mentioned, which I think is important, that we can come back to that, and also the sustainably funded systems for collecting, sorting and recycling, which that's super helpful. I would now like to introduce our last speaker in this first tour de table, and Griffins, from the perspective of civil society, which I think you to some extent represent in this panel. What is the most important measure that this treaty should contain, in your view, to enhance circularity of plastics? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Magnus, and for inviting me to bring the views of public interest civil society organizations. First, I just wanted to put this into context. We don't know if plastics can become circular materials, like materials such as glass, aluminum, and other metals. For example, plastic recycling has failed because so little is recycled, and also the little that is recycled raises health and environmental concerns because of the toxic ingredients in most of these plastics. Second, circularity must be defined accurately, and it must not include, for instance, technologies such as incineration, chemical recycling that basically churns out toxics, and that is not circular. Just putting this into context. So we know that in the question that you just raised, plastic economy, for instance, won't move from linearity to circularity with one single policy decision. It requires intervention across the entire life cycle of plastic. And that, for instance, limiting polymer production like PVCs, ban on certain plastics, products, and criteria for others. So there's no single bullet. However, the common aspect that runs through each of these is that the elimination of toxic chemicals, including the polymers like PVCs and polystyrene from the plastic life cycle, is the first fundamental step to creating a circular economy that is toxic-free. So in our view, the elimination of toxic chemicals is very fundamental to create the toxic-free circular economy. Because toxic circularity is not true circularity, the treaty must empower the parties who will be parties to this treaty to be able to achieve circularity that is toxic-free. And that will be coupled with interventions that is running across the full life cycle of plastic. including that other speakers that I also mentioned that I want to mention as another point, the issue of transparency as an enabler for full disclosure of information on plastic ingredients as a single measure that also enable the circularity. I would give examples, for instance, particularly from the developing countries. We have, as an organization, have done studies and evidence around toxic chemicals that are in recycled plastic. And there's a big challenge from a developing country perspective because there's no full disclosure of this information or even enabler to identify these toxic chemicals. So it's in most of the products that we have in many developing countries as in terms of the recycled plastic products or including children toys that we sell and are sold everywhere, for instance, in Kenya. So thank you very much for your question. I look forward to discussing more on this.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Griffiths, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. And I will now just ask a few follow-up questions to each of the panelists. And I would encourage those in the audience, if you have any questions or wish to make a comment, please write them in the Q&A box. And I see that many of you have already done that, and we will get to those questions in a minute. You can also raise your hand if you would like to make a live intervention, and then we will take as many interventions as we have time for in this meeting. I would like to first ask some follow-up questions to you, Oliver, about this proposal for a global plastic pollution fee, or GPPF, I think is the acronym used. There has been many views expressed about what this treaty should contain in the written submissions to the second session of the INC in Paris. Based on your reading of those submissions and where you see these negotiations going, is the proposal, in your view, for a global plastic pollution fee expected to attract sufficient support from other states participating in the negotiations? And do you see any challenges in terms of socializing and gathering support for this idea?
Yeah, Magnus, I am very optimistic that there is sufficient support for a pollution fee. This fee seeks to implement the polluter pays principle, which has been a cornerstone for tackling environmental problems since at least the Rio Declaration. At least 20 other governments have said that the treaty should implement the polluter pays principle. Based on our discussions with governments, I feel support for pollution fee is growing. Governments realize increasingly that with a pollution fee, the burden of financing treaty implementation is shared with the private sector and not just imposed on government budgets. The pollution fee could also reduce overall plastic production, which provides another effective way to end plastic pollution. In addition, the pollution fee enjoys support beyond governments. The OECD's modeling finds that a charge on virgin plastics is an essential part of the policy mix that are needed to end plastic pollution. UN Habitat, for example, has proposed a fee as part of a global EPR scheme. Several NGOs have also embraced the idea. An example are CIEL, the EIA, and then the Mindero Foundation, just to name a few. This gives us a strong base for further discussions at INC2 on how best to implement the polluter pays principle in the treaty, so as to find full treaty implementation. Thank you very much, Magnus.
Thank you so much for that, Oliver. And I think you actually answered now one of the questions that came up in the Q&A box, where the question was whether this global fee will be integrated into extended producer responsibility systems. And I guess the short answer to that question, Oliver, based on your remark just now, is yes. Is that correct, that the idea here is to have this fee integrated into EPR systems? Is that correct?
Yes, that is exactly the case. Matter of fact, GPPF is just an acronym or a new name for a global EPR scheme. The EPRs that we are familiar with are always at the national level, and they always are a burden on companies like Nestle, who are using already produced plastics to do their packaging. And so those who are really responsible for the production of plastics, which is at the upstream end of the life cycle, they are not held accountable. And so this GPPF is a global EPR scheme, and it is holding those who are actually producing the polymers that eventually turn into plastics accountable. And I think it should be complementary to the national EPR schemes that we are all familiar with now. So yes, it's one and the same, but this one on the global scale rather than at the national level.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Oliver. I'd like to move on. I have more questions for you, and I'm sure that other people in the audience also have more questions for you. So please stay tuned. But I would also like to follow up with some questions to you, Stina. And last week, we did have a discussion in this format, as I mentioned, about measures that could help reduce the total production and consumption of plastics. And what is the relationship between these sustainability criteria proposed for product design and manufacturing on the one hand, and these proposed provisions to eliminate and restrict production of plastics more generally? Can you have, I mean, also building upon what Griffin's just said, can you have circularity without total reduction? What's the relationship here?
Yes, thanks for that question. So the difference between these two provisions, as we see it, is that one targets the things that we want to keep in the economy and to improve, and the other targets the things that we have to take out of the plastic economy. So we see the need for a mechanism in the plastic treaty that identifies the most harmful polymers, chemicals, and plastic products and target these for elimination or certain specific restrictions. And in our view, there are already some specific polymers, chemicals, and also products that we already can identify and eliminate or restrict based on the risks they pose. But plastic will also continue to play an important role in many products that we're going to have in the society. And when designing those products, we have to make sure that the environmental footprint throughout the life cycle is taken into account. So that is why we're also suggesting a provision that will require all products to be designed and manufactured in line with certain sustainability criteria, if they are to be put on the market. I hope that clarifies.
It does indeed. Thank you. Thank you so much for clarifying that. And can I just also quickly ask you, these sustainability criteria, do we already have those? Do we know what those criteria should be, those criteria to design and manufacture for circularity? Or is this something that we will have to develop and negotiate later on? Do you envisage these criteria to be elaborated in this INC process that we're in now, or as part rather of the implementation process following the treaty's adoption?
Well, the treaty would need to contain some overarching sustainability criteria in our view. And as we have suggested in our submission, these criteria could address the need to reduce the use of plastic, for example, as was mentioned, to reduce overhead space in plastic packaging. They could address the need to design for reuse, or they could address the need to design items to be durable with a long lifespan, such as plastic parts in construction. And such overarching criteria should definitely be part of the treaty. But it is also clear that we have such an array of different plastic products out there, and the criteria will have to be further outlined in technical terms for different sectors, product groups, even for products if that's necessary. So one challenge is to envision what criteria will go into the treaty and how these will influence the making of certain guidelines and standards and labels and similar. So we have to be able to take into account updated knowledge as it develops. And it's quite clear for us that we will require to any further work after the adoption of the treaty. We cannot have everything set at once. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Stina. I would now like to turn to Amila again, and I'd like to ask you, from your research on this, are you aware, or to what extent have these circularity measures that have been proposed so far in the discussion, so to what extent have they been sort of tried and tested at a national or regional level? And if they have, what has been the main challenges related to their implementation? And maybe I could also just attach a small additional question to that. Do these measures that we talk about place a greater implementation burden on some countries than others?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Mangus. Yeah, I would like to, of course, there are certain circular models applied and tested and running up to some level, and maybe some are successful. Yeah, I like to start with one example, in Japan. So like the country I'm living, so it's easy for me to take that example. Like there are some certain circular models tested and running successfully, and there is a forum called Partnership for Circular Economy, Japan Partnership for Circular Economy, JFORCE. So I will share the link after this during this webinar, so after my answer. So there you can find so many examples. One example, like I like to highlight here, very simple one. Maybe it's not listed in that forum, but I like to point out it. PET bottles, so Japan achieved around maybe more than 90% PET bottle recycling. There, I like to highlight one point. Even we can have hot beverages served in the vending machines. If you want to keep hot beverages in PET bottles, so you need to add a nylon layer or nylon fiber for the structural stability. So then if you go for mechanical recycling, so it's kind of troublesome. What they're doing is channel that for chemical recycling, and there they use identification, the ring we used to tight the cap, so that ring made in a different color, orange color. So then such kind of things channel for chemical recycling. The rest mostly goes for mechanical recycling. So that way, like information sharing and different technological approaches. So then sometime you can successfully run circular model to reduce the virgin polymer usage, and maybe to avoid the environmental pollution by leaking the plastics. But of course you need to consider about the overall life cycle, GHG emissions and chemical pollutants kind of things. But further, I think this is kind of achieving certain target rather than just having perfect system from the beginning. But that's a kind of a successful situation. But I like to highlight the other side. For example, of course, in certain regions, so when we implement projects, so we found that certain challenges facing. However, in many developing countries, but I need to highlight this point as well. Like when I was a child, so there were circular models originally in those countries. For example, we used to repair our shoes. Cobbler was there, so then we used to repair our shoes for many times, and we reduce and we reuse the consumption. However, if we go now after 20 years, so then we can see just one time use and throw away, just dumping, or it goes to the landfill, or maybe marine pollution kind of things. But I will come back to the I'm coming back to the answer again. One example I found is in real case, the plastic bags. So certain country wanted to implement more circular replacement for plastic bags. So they stop or ban through policy measures the plastic HDPE bags, grocery bags, and then they introduce PLA bags. However, in the country, there were no monitoring system, so they didn't have capacity to monitor. So there were no sufficient equipment, and same time there was no information disclosure process. They just say PLA or something. Even the importer says certain thing, so the country doesn't have the capacity to monitor exact composition. So then we know circularity, or this works well when you design certain management system. Like there should be a perfect or best fitting system to tackle the through the life cycle. But when the system expects certain thing and actual product is a lot different from the expectation, the system fails. So such kind of situations we can find like that's one example I mentioned. So to address that, I think like I like to highlight the same point, information disclosure, and then also we need capacity building. I like to bring one example related to capacity building as well. At the moment, we are implementing BRS sector under BRS Secretariat funding, the transboundary movement, Basel Convention plastic waste amendments. So import-export information. So we introduced a toolkit to the country, and we trained the custom officers to gather information, and through that increasing the information related to the plastic products. So based on that, producing inventory for the country. So such kind of capacity building can help to effective implementation of the circular model, not only within one country or not only within one region for global wise, because we are targeting the global plastic treaty, and this should address this should be all inclusive system. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Amila, for that. Very helpful. You managed the importance of disclosure, and we have received a question from the audience that I actually wanted to field to you, Jody. I think it may have been directed to you. I'll read it out. So the question is partly a comment, partly a question. It says that disclosure is good, but how do you see the business sector responding to transparency policies that may require them to publish all chemical compositions of plastic packaging materials and their implications in different environments? Would you take a crack at that question, Jody?
Sure. I mean, we have to put it into context. Business is a very diverse and broad group, and business might be a local cafe on the side of a road, or it might be a multinational that's producing plastic for fishing nets, or it might be a consumer packaged good company like my company. So even speaking for the Business Coalition, we're a very diverse group. In terms of disclosure, I think the good business practice is to comply with all national and regional or local laws. The good practice for government is to put in place the laws that they'd like to see complied with, and companies need to do their part complying with the law. When we look at disclosure around ingredients in plastics, the question is, well, where in the supply chain? And I can't address the tire industry or the textile industry or the construction industry, so I'll just focus on consumer goods because that's the sector that my business is in. We have a value chain that's quite long, and the value chain includes upstream producers of resins. It includes packaging converters, who are specialized companies who may buy plastic resins and other components and make packaging. Then it includes companies, for example, like Nestle, that's a user of packaging. And then we have retail partners who are selling products in packaged goods to consumers. Then there's the downstream that works in the collection and sorting, reuse, and recycling. And so when we look at the question of disclosure, the question is, what should be disclosed by which segment of the industry? And I think that that's really perhaps the heart, if I understood the question by this attendee correctly, is that governments in the treaty will need to specify which segment of the value chain would they like to disclose which information. For example, we and many of the Business Coalition members are part of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation Global Commitment, part of a group of only 150 companies that voluntarily disclose their plastic footprint every year out of millions of companies globally. We encourage disclosure, and we've been modeling it since 2018. And we hope that governments will put in place a legally binding agreement that will ultimately mandate the right kind of disclosure applied to the right portion of the value chain. This probably comes back to the treaty requiring appendices that are not only industry specific, but are application specific.
Thank you so much for that, Jody. A couple of more questions for you, and I'd like first to ask a question about EPR, this EPR scheme that you mentioned initially, of course, and I think we heard a bit from Amila that there is, implementing an extended producer responsibility scheme may have mean different things in different contexts. And of course, the Business Coalition and others have stressed the need for a new treaty to level the playing field. What can we do to ensure that this measure is perceived as fair? And secondly, I just want to attach another question, and sorry about that, from the audience as well. What can we do to make sure to avoid that an EPR scheme is not used as a way, as put by this participant, for big firms as a way for their greenwashing? So those are sort of two questions, a bit different.
The second one, I'm really not sure how to even get into, but I'll address EPR and the question of how do we ensure it's fair, and if I may add on, what in fact should we include in the treaty in the perspective of the Business Coalition. We think that minimum requirements for both the design and the implementation of EPR are really important to ensure that not only there's an adequate level of regulatory harmonization, but also to make sure that the EPR system can be a well-designed policy tool. We see a wide range of EPR systems today. I'd mentioned before the numbers that we've observed 58 countries now have national EPR schemes, and another 38 have draft legislation under development in Parliament. They're all different. So compliance is a challenge in that context, and every country has to have a different compliance regime. So we hope that the treaty will require every country around the world to implement EPR policies that will reduce mismanaged waste. Could start with the packaged goods sector, because we recognize that's about 40% of plastic use today. But the treaty needs to define some key principles. Those principles can be in a couple areas: the design and the implementation of EPR policies, a harmonized approach to the scope of covered materials. How do you define which materials are included? How do you define which materials are excluded? Will polyester clothing be included, or only PET bottles? Will fishing nets be included? How will tires be treated? All of these materials use plastic, and it's important to have an initial framework that we can start with and build on. The activities also need to be included in EPR, as well as the targets for the system. By activities, I mean the financing of collection, the financing of sorting, and the financing of recycling. Because in some countries we've observed EPR fees have been set up, but those fees are not necessarily used to pay for the collection of certain types of packaging materials. This is a real challenge because EPR fees in an ideal system will be applied to every material uniquely, so that the EPR fee for tires or the EPR fee for PET bottles or for a plastic box would actually cover the full cost of collecting that material from consumers and establishing collection systems, sorting it in dedicated facilities, and bringing it to dedicated recycling facilities, either in that country or a closely located neighboring country. The roles and responsibilities of different stakeholders also need to be defined, from one producer responsibility organization that's facilitating the system and managing the collection of fees jointly, usually with the National Treasury, to the involvement of the informal sector. How will their jobs be preserved? And to the point that Oliver, our colleague from Ghana, had made earlier, how do we increase the number of jobs, particularly in sorting and collection, that EPR can deliver so that we can address low levels of employment? Lastly, reporting, monitoring, and enforcement. Reporting, we can set standards. Monitoring, we can define best practices. Enforcement and corruption prevention are absolutely key, and they're also differing from country to country in terms of both what's necessary. So we know we have a lot of great thinkers who have tremendous experience implementing the existing EPR systems and improving the ones that have been built decades ago. And we hope as the Business Coalition to bring that type of experience to the table and support governments in defining a basic framework for harmonized EPR that will deliver the clean environment that people all over the world want. Because we know we can finance this. We just need the combination of both business, government, and civil society working together on a new system.
Thank you so much for addressing those, to some extent, tricky questions, Jody. That was great. I would now like to turn to you, Fiona, again as well. And of course, as we have talked about previously in discussion last week, we discussed measures to reduce the total production and consumption of plastics, and several panelists then suggested that we need to prohibit or phase out specific products or applications of material of concern. Now it's unclear exactly what kind of products and materials we're talking about here, but I wanted to ask you a question, and maybe also building upon some of the questions that have come up in the chat box. Are there some flexible packaging products or applications that we can do without, that we could subject to a phase out or a phase down provision, rather than or in addition to a so some circularity measures? I'd like to ask you that question, please, Fiona.
Sure, thanks, Magnus. Maybe first, just to clarify, CFlex is a technical project, and our focus is really on making flexible packaging circular. And our stakeholders are members of other associations who probably would also have a view on this. But maybe I could use an example. It's a European example. I know Europe is not the world, but we have the data for Europe. Half of the units of primary food packaging on the market in Europe are flexible packaging. So, that just gives you a feel for the amount and the need and the role that flexible packaging makes and contributes to society. That's in units. The amount of the overall weight of primary food packaging on the European market, flexibles accounts for only 1/6 of that. So it's a very efficient way. As CFlex, we don't have a position on which specific formats may be, considered unnecessary. I would just make a more kind of general observation that flexible packaging has economic and environmental advantages. And when we solve, and that's what we're working to do, when we solve the end of life issues, then it can even contribute more to society in a positive way.
Thank you, Fiona. We also have a question from the audience that was for you, and I want to direct this to you if you'd like to try to answer it. The question is, how available are circular alternatives in the global south compared to the global north? Is this global south, global north distinction relevant to your proposal in the context of these negotiations?
If I understood the question, I guess we're talking about infrastructure. I think there are some learnings from the global north actually for flexible packaging that could be applied in the global treaty. The first one is that we know from legislation that's been adopted in Europe that really there's a need for legally binding measures to include flexible packaging from the outset. So that's one kind of key learning that I would say. A second key learning as well is that we need to focus on design for circularity. And CFlex has already adopted design for circularity criteria. They're available on our website. So we know how to do this already. And in terms of the infrastructure, yes, we have case studies and examples of, mechanical infrastructure that's being operated at scale, not just in the global north, also in the global south, in Ghana, in India, in Indonesia. But I think one of the key challenges and where the global treaty can really help is to make sure that this material is collected and sorted for recycling. The problem is not a technical problem. It's more, getting the legislation in place to make sure that it happens, as I said in my opening statement. I hope that answers the participant's question.
I do believe so. Thank you as well for offering and framing an interpretation of the question. Last question to you, Fiona, before I turn to Griffin's for some follow-up questions for him as well. This is also a question from one of the audience, whether you are able to very quickly give one example of a circular flexible packaging that is doing well in the market and how well it does in increasing recycling rates. That would, yeah, if you have one example, that would be super helpful for that participant, I think.
Sure. Measuring recycling rates for a particular packaging type is a bit difficult because, they're not traced per type. But we do know that the research that we're doing shows that there are already end markets for flexible packaging, for example, in collation wrap, shrink films, things like that. But I think we can do better. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we have these design criteria, why they're so important, so that packaging is not designed just with compatibility with collection, sorting and recycling systems in mind, but also it needs to be designed with what is the recycled material going to be used for in mind. So we're in a transition phase, and we are confident that with the right measures in place and with the design criteria being fully implemented, that more end markets and more applications will become regularly used, and that flexible packaging will have definitely a role to play in a circular economy.
Great, thank you so much for addressing those questions, Fiona. I would now like to turn to you, Griffins, again, and we actually have a question from the audience that I wanted to start with, where there's a request for some clarification on why incineration and chemical recycling, in your view, is not to be considered in the circularity of plastics. So I don't know if you would like to offer a bit of an elaboration on this. Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you, Magnus, for that question. So just to answer that question, the resolution from UNEA defined the issue of environmentally sound management as very critical in the management of plastic and addressing the plastic pollution crisis. So we also have the Basel Convention that is developing technical guidelines on plastic waste management, for instance, and the chemical recycling thermal process issue is still not agreed upon within the technical working group that to adopt these technical guidelines that parties will be able to use in implementing that, simply because there's no clear peer-reviewed reference or evidence from research that has proven this to be environmentally sound. So we cannot be able to, from our view, to introduce this sort of solution when we do not have agreed upon global evidence that is proven to be environmentally sound in order to address the problem. So we solving one by promoting a technology, whereas bringing in or having unintended negative consequences is not the solution at the moment. So just to answer the question, is that this is still not agreed upon because there's no clear agreed upon peer-reviewed reference or evidence that this is proven to be environmentally sound. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Griffins. I think that clarifies matters. Also, we have another question from the audience that I do believe you may have some perspectives on, and this is a general question, whether you have any ideas on how to eliminate plastics in a sustainable way. I do think the answer to that is yes, but then it's a more precise question of whether it would be possible to eliminate sustainably with incineration in the generation of energy, waste to energy. Is that, in your view, part of the circularity solution? You're on mute, I think.
Sorry. Yeah, to answer that question, as I mentioned earlier, this is not part of the sustainable solutions that we want to promote it. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. That's very clear. I also wanted to ask you, also Griffins, we talked a bit about differences in national circumstances, and one of the questions here in the Q&A is asking whether there's any plans for developing global implementation plan or global national action plans. And I was just wondering what extent these measures, circularity measures, Griffins, should they be developed to apply globally to all parties equally in the new treaty? And how do we account for differences in national circumstances?
Thank you again for that question. As I said, and to answer this, we do not know yet it's possible to make, for instance, plastic circular, because we know that right now recycling is not safe, and plastic products would have little value, and for instance, it will not enable the global North countries to export this to the developing countries for recycling. Having said that, because these plastics move across boundaries at every stage of the life cycle, it will be impossible to solve the crisis, plastic pollution, through national measures only. So there is need for global standards to allow that circularity, and ensuring that the measures of circularity that I mentioned earlier in terms of hazardous chemicals in plastics is eliminated, would, for instance, promote. So to answer the question, there is need for that global standards in order to enable the national actions to be able to be efficient, and also to promote the the issue of circularity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Griffins. I would now like to also open. We have a number of questions as well in the Q&A that we can get to, but I see that we have 2 hands raised. So I will now open for some live interventions from the audience. And I'd like first to give the floor to Alejandra Gonzalez. Please introduce yourself and ask your question or make your comment. Please, Alejandra, you have the floor.
Thank you, Magnus, and thank you for panelists and participants for the interesting conversation. I think it's very encouraging to observe the level of alignment between various actors on the benefits of mandatory global standards and requirements, including product materials and design standards, but also on recycling and waste management systems. However, what we saw from the negotiations and during the INC1 is that we need to move fast from abstracts to specifics as soon as possible. So my question is related to what specific requirements and for which products and systems do we need for reuse and non-toxic circular economy in the treaty. Take, for example, contact-sensitive food and beverage packaging as an example. So what do you see as the top 1 to 3 necessary requirements for increasing reuse and recycling of these applications?
Thank you so much for that, Alejandra. That's a great question, and I would encourage the panelists, if you wish to address this question, to please raise your hand. But I will just first go to and include another intervention from the floor as well before we go to back to the panel. I would like to now give the floor to Baptiste Roubaud for a brief question. Please, Baptiste, you have the floor. And please unmute your microphone and kindly introduce yourself. I do not think that we're able to hear the question from Baptiste. Baptiste, can you hear us? It doesn't look like it. Okay, then I will move back to you, Jody, for Alejandra's question about the specificity in applications with respect to these measures. Please, you have the floor, Jody.
And particularly as she called out consumer goods, the Business Coalition supports reuse and refill, and we've endorsed a vision statement that includes moving away from single-use plastics in favor of reusable and more durable solutions, designing products and systems for all plastics to be reused or recycled in practice and at scale, and accelerating uptake of business and delivery models for these new systems. Now, we recognize that there are actually a number of enabling conditions that could be created by governments so that industry value chains can actually start collaborating to scale up reuse and refill systems, because many of the companies in the coalition have invested in significant numbers of pilots. Our company alone has done 20 pilots in 12 countries, and we've identified a number of challenges. So I'll share some of the challenges identified by members of the coalition. One of them is legislation at the national level for a category by category approach to reuse and refill for packaged consumer goods, recognizing the differences between food and beverage, personal care, household care products within categories. The second is decarbonizing the logistics system away from fossil fuels and toward carbon neutral forms of transportation. There'll also likely be the need to support investments to modify industrial capacities, such as investments in pooled packaging, packaging that can be shared by many companies, packaging reuse or return systems and bins, or regional washing facilities to enable SMEs to access the same shared pool that global companies could use. We also need to reflect on what type of regional or global standards for systems hygiene, safety, and quality management can be used. And we recognize groups like the World Economic Forum and PR3 who've already done a lot of work advancing voluntary standards. Lastly, I'll point out that we also need communication programs to drive consumer acceptance. Most consumers appreciate convenience in our personal lives. We're all consumers. And we need to communicate why this shift mandated by governments to reuse and refill systems for certain product categories is in the overall public interest. And that's a challenge to communicate, and it's likely going to take many years of dedicated communication and education at all levels of society.
Thank you so much for that, Jody. If any of the other panelists would like to come in on this question, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I will move on to some other questions. And we have one other request for the floor. And that's Nagwa El Karawi. Please, you have the floor. Please introduce yourself and make your kindly make your intervention brief.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nagwa El Karawi. I'm from Egypt. We are recently implementing EPR. We are trying to put together all the stakeholders together because this is the way we see it is going to work. My question is how all the presenter available here are working together. Of course, this is not the first time you met together, you met with each other, but how do we make that implementation is going to be based on everyone working together? Because this is going to be the only way. Without that, that's what we are facing right now, especially we are trying to implement the single-use plastic alone. That's what we're starting with. So how all of you are working together in putting a comprehensive plan to be reflected in INDC. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that question. And if any of the panelists would like to address that, please do raise your hand. I do think that, of course, we are here representing to some extent different institutions and all participants, either as states or stakeholders in the treaty process, and collaborating, of course, in that respect. The treaty making process is a collaborative effort. But I see, Fiona, that you have your hand up, and thank you very much for some reflections on that question.
Yeah, hopefully this will go some way to answer the question. At CFLEX, EPR is kind of a critical, I mean, our model to make flexible packaging circular hinges on EPR. And we have developed some what we call criteria for circularity, which include, operational, financial recommendations, steps that are needed to ensure that flexibles are captured, are collected, sourced, and recycled, and included in the system. And at least in Europe, we work with a number of EPR schemes to provide, technical support and to offer suggestions and recommendations for how the EPR system can function with the inclusion of flexibles. So that's also available on our website, those criteria for circularity.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Oliver, also on this question, please, you have the floor.
Yes. First of all, I think a colleague from Egypt has asked a very, very important question. Currently, I think the biggest problem that most countries have, even if they are implementing an EPR scheme, is the lack of infrastructure and also the lack of funds to take care of the costs that are associated with implementing an effective EPR scheme. And so the fee that we are proposing, for example, that's the global EPR scheme, if I can call it that way, is saying that that fee should be used to provide effective infrastructure for all countries. Now, if a country has an EPR scheme that they don't have the right infrastructure to be able to do the collection, the transportation, sorting, and recycling, they are not going to achieve their national objectives. And so for commonality, every country should have access to effective infrastructure for the collection of waste and the sorting and recycling. That's the first. Every country should also have funds. And we believe that the proposal that we have submitted is going to provide enough funding for all the needs of each country. Also, it is going to address the problem of legacy plastic, because we don't anticipate that when this treaty comes into force, it is only going to take care of plastics that are generated in the future, because we do have existing problems, and that has to be addressed by this treaty. And it is only through the collection of enough revenues to take care of both infrastructure and then the service delivery within each country, and also address the existing problem of legacy plastic pollution.
Thank you so much for that, Oliver. I think those two, both you and Fiona, addressed that question from our colleague from Egypt. We have about 8 minutes left of this webinar, and there's a few questions that have come in from the audience that I would also like to address to you. And the first one is an open one to all of you. Several of you have mentioned the need for global standards, and the question is which body or institution that you envisage will develop these standards. And the ISO, the International Standards Organization, is mentioned, or maybe your reflections on other ways to develop, implement, and enforce these upcoming standardization processes. So that's an open question, so please raise your hand. While we're waiting for that, and while you're thinking about that, I'd actually like to ask a question to you, Stina, based on something that came up in the Q&A a little bit earlier, and that's the question of human rights. And there's been much talk about the need for a human rights approach in these negotiations. And I wanted to ask you whether, in your view, there is a place for considering human rights in the development of the sustainability criteria specifically, or circularity measures more broadly, and if so, how?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I think it is important that the treaty does take into consideration the effects that plastic pollution has on human health. So that is definitely something that we have put into our submission, and that we have to consider in the negotiations going forward, how it is to be reflected. When it comes to specific sustainability criteria, we would definitely have to look into what they could be on a global level. I think that we in the treaty would have to put on some overarching criteria for the plastic products, and it will be interesting to see how those overarching criteria will then be further developed after the treaty has been adopted, and also in different standardization processes. So this is something that we have to continuously work on. So looking forward to the further discussions on that. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Stina. I see first Amila and then Jody. Amila, you have the floor, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mangus. I think that's a very important question. However, from scientist side, I'm not going to exactly answer that what kind of body we need or something. But what I can mention is we need scientific evidence-based support to establish such kind of system. And at the moment, we have certain challenges like the full life cycle impact estimation scientifically. So there are certain groups working on it, like Marilka or CTEC, Society of Environmental Toxicology, and kind of societies, plus Science Coalition, like which I'm representing now. So we are kind of supporting to provide scientific information to establish evidence-based such kind of system. So I would like to encourage everyone to have communication with such kind of entities. Having said that, I will hand over to you. Yeah.
Many thanks. Jody, you have any reflections on this?
Yeah, I wanted to share an example of a voluntary initiative that's launched specifically to look at human rights and the overall waste management sector, particularly in relationship to plastics, because we know that the workers who are in the supply chain and working on collection play a very substantial and a valuable role, both in collection, sorting, and also recycling of packaging waste and other materials. And they're also vulnerable to a broad range of human rights impacts. So even if recycling is delivering positive environmental impacts, it really requires heightened human rights due diligence, both from companies in the plastic waste to recycling value chain, but also from governments. And to date, industry and government as a collective whole hasn't meaningfully or significantly engaged with the social conditions and human rights impacts in the sector. And so as we're working to end plastic pollution, we also need to look at how we support the development of the treaty. We also have to think about how do we drive a fair circular economy for plastics. Our company, along with several others, the Tier Fund, Shift, the Global Alliance for Waste Pickers, and WeGo, Women in the Informal Economy, Globalizing and Organizing, had worked together over the past 2 years. And we had launched last year, it was called the Fair Circularity Initiative, which you can find online at faircircularity.org is the website. We spent 1.5 years working together, consulting individual workers and members of the Global Alliance and WeGo in order to develop the fair circularity principles, which were aligned with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which many companies around the world and many governments have aligned with, as it's linked to the Global Compact. And we encourage more voluntary engagement with these principles to ensure human rights are respected. We're looking to expand the group of companies voluntarily applying them, but we're also advocating in the context of the treaty to include human rights and the rights of waste workers with this lens of fair circularity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Jody. Then we had both the human health and the human rights perspectives here reflected in the discussion, so thank you for that. I would now like to give the floor to you, Oliver, to address also that open question about the development of these global standards. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Magnus. Yeah, the resolution calls for the establishment of a scientific body within the treaty. We believe that this scientific body should be given the responsibility to develop the standards that will be uniform and applicable to all member states. And so the open question was, how do we ensure that we have standards that are common and acceptable to all members? And we should, I think, assign this responsibility of coming up with standards for the implementation of the treaty to this scientific body that we are going to set up. In addition to that, I think the scientific body should also be given the responsibility of monitoring and ensuring that there is regular and effective reporting from all member states so that we can see the progress of the implementation of this treaty. And I think these two responsibilities are key if we are going to have a successful implementation of this legally binding instrument.
Thank you so much for that, Oliver. Very useful reflections on how these standards may be developed. I see also that, Fiona, you have some reflections on this. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, and I'll be quick because I see that our time is running out. Just wanted to say, if standards are developed, for example, for design for circularity criteria, from our point of view, it would be very important that the criteria are based on transparent and publicly available evidence. We're currently carrying out testing to really to fill in gaps in knowledge on what is actually recyclable and what's not recyclable. So, and this will be publicly available. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Fiona. And indeed, thanks to all of you in the panel, and also thanks to everybody in the audience who've asked their questions, both in the Q&A box and through live interventions. We are running out of time and are approaching the end of today's webinar. I think that the discussion that we had today, just as the discussion we had last week on reducing production consumption of plastics, is a help as we prepare, all of us and many others outside this panel, for the second session of the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee in Paris in a couple of months. I would like, before closing, to also give a big thanks to colleagues Ingrid Arndal, who have organized this event. I think it's fantastic that we have a chance to meet. Although it's a little bit short of time, it's great that we have a chance to meet, to touch base and share perspectives and thoughts. And please note that there will be another event in this format also in a couple of weeks. We have discussed today, of course, only maybe an important, but still one part of the provisions that have been proposed for inclusion in this treaty. So on Monday, the 3rd of April, from 2 p.m. Central European time, there will be a discussion about potential treaty provisions to eliminate and restrict hazardous chemicals and intentionally added microplastics. I do believe we touched upon particularly the chemical side in this discussion. There were some questions about that. We'll have a chance then on the 3rd of April to discuss that in more depth. So please stay tuned for that event on Monday, the 3rd of April from 2 p.m. Central European time. Hope many of you will be back for that. With that, I say thank you again to the panel, and I close the session. Farewell, and see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.